These blocks of A4 will be familiar to many Australians. They're on the shelves of one of our biggest office suppliers, Officeworks. Fuji Xerox sells them as well. They've even got a green label lauding the use of plantation wood.
I think they're greenwashing. They're just basically trying to convince us they're doing the right thing by the environment, but in fact, oftentimes what they're doing is pretty paltry.
The view from the company's helicopter reveals an operation of staggering size. Our tour guide is April's Director of Operations, David Kerr.
So this is the biggest mill on the planet. The biggest. Yep.
The mill is fed by a patchwork of plantations where native forest once stood. Little's left beyond slender fingers of forest on rivers and streams. April says its land management stands in stark contrast to the illegal logging and burning that scars neighbouring property.
What we're doing is we're doing it in a responsible way in line with what the Indonesian government wants. If we don't do it the way that we're doing it, it can be even worse.
Why do you leave these single tall trees around the place? It's a requirement, a legal requirement to keep some special species that we come across when we're harvesting. They look pretty lonely. Yeah, they do.
Mowing down vast expanses of primary forest, converting it into monocultures of exotic trees, which are grown to be 4 or 5 years old and then cut down like you'd cut the grass and turned into paper pulp. This is not something I define as environmentally sustainable. It's something different altogether.
Near April's mill at Kerinci, the sentiment is more positive. The villagers the company introduced us to say their lives have changed for the better.
Nah, itu memang sangat menggembirakan kan, dikarenakan sarana jalan bisa rapi, sarana pendidikan pun dibantu juga kan, sarana olahraga, sarana semua itu kayaknya stabil lah untuk maju bersama gitu kan. Nah, jadi ya sangat senang lah kedatangan ada perusahaan, ada masuk kemari peduli masyarakat kan gitu. Jadi masyarakat pun ya saling menghargai, menghormati gitu.
While April holds out its presence in Kerinci as something of a model operation, just an hour away, we find a very different story. This is the Kampar Peninsula, where it's not just the clearing and tree felling which blights the landscape. Corruption runs as deep and murky as the Kampar River itself. Many of the companies here found a local governor only too willing to accommodate their operations for the right price. And if it wasn't for a diligent local police chief named Pak Sujiptadi, a catalogue of bribes and dodgy permit deals would never have been exposed.
Pak Suciptadi saat itu sangat luar biasa, sangat bagus. Dia tidak peduli dengan kontroversi atau tekanan dari siapapun di saat itu. Bahkan banyak sekali tokoh-tokoh politisi di Riau saat itu menghujat mereka dan tokoh-tokoh masyarakat yang saat itu menghujat dia tidak peduli.
Sujiptadi stunned locals like environmental activist Zulfami, who were used to having their concerns swept aside by powerful officials. He investigated both the big companies and their smaller suppliers.
Di belakang saya ini terjadi kerusakan hutan yang sangat hebat, yaitu akibat perizinan yang salah.
The local governor was convicted of taking bribes in exchange for forestry concessions. He'd even cashed a cheque for $250,000 written by April's Indonesian subsidiary.
I'm not aware of that incident, but I will say that we run this company with the highest standards of corporate governance, and we don't stand for any of our employees be involved in any illegal activities.
April says the cheque was made out to one of its suppliers to pay for a shipment of wood, and the company did not authorise it to be used in any other way. But the exact role of April's subsidiary and the other companies was never properly examined. The police chief was suddenly transferred, and his successor shut down the investigation, citing a lack of evidence.
Hancur harapan kecewa, sedih, marah, semuanya bercampur. Tidak hanya saya, tapi banyak sekali masyarakat Riau.
When a presidential task force looked into the scandal in March this year, it was concerned enough to urge the police to re-examine the companies involved. While the government officials have been jailed, the companies have still got their plantations just behind this tree line, and their seeds of corruption will probably still grow into healthy profits. Community leader Jasri Nando grew up on the Kampar River and watched as the once familiar landscape was turned into this.
Semuanya menolak dari awal. Setelah itu mungkin ada untung-untungan dari perusahaan. Perusahaan itu kan siapa yang kuat di dalam daerah itu akan dirangkul. Jadi satu persatu. Jadi beransur-ansur menurun.
Nando is taking us to one of the striking remnants of the original forest.
Seperti alam kayak gini, kami tidak mau kehilangan alam ini.
It's a beautiful monument to what's been lost.
Ya, perasaan marah sih. Tapi kemarahan tuh nggak nyampe gitu. Mau harus dikemanakan.
This tree marks another extraordinary feature of the Kampar Peninsula. Its roots burrow down into deep, wet, carbon-rich peat.
Well, this is one big peat dome. Right.
Lafcadio Cortesi from the Rainforest Action Network warns logging on the peat risks a greenhouse gas disaster.
There are these huge banks or reservoirs of carbon that has been accumulating over certainly thousands and maybe even tens of thousands of years.
April's plantations can't thrive in the damp peat, so the company digs canals to drain off the water. And when the peat dries, it releases great clouds of greenhouse gas.
We're seeing hundreds of thousands of hectares of deep peat being converted to plantations. Indonesia is the world's third largest greenhouse gas emitter, and that is coming not from smokestacks, it's coming from the conversion of these forests and these peatlands, which are emitting massive amounts of carbon. So there's a lot at stake.
April is only preserving the most sensitive site at the centre of the peninsula. The area is known as the Peat Dome, where the peat is the deepest.
In English, it stands for Orchid Lake, and it's a high-value conservation area that we've actually expanded around it because it's a special place for us. Lots of biodiversity, buffered by our acacia plantations and thriving naturally in the bush.
April says it's protecting this delicate ecosystem by building new dams on its canals to stop the peat from draining too fast.
Overall, it's the real-world solution in terms of keeping the high conservation value areas intact and establishing sustainability for our company.
The bottom line is that they're going to be lowering the water levels, and how that impacts the whole dome, the whole ecosystem, is really anyone's guess.
As its appetite for fresh forests and new plantations grows, April is spreading its operations out into the Malacca Strait between Sumatra and Singapore.